When I started out photography, I lived in aperture priority. I just stuck the aperture as low as possible because that's what you do when you get lenses that have a nice shallow depth of field. I just shot everything aperture priority, and I thought that was the way to do things. And it was less an artistic decision, if I'm being honest, on my part, and it was more because I was afraid of shooting manual because I assumed it was so complicated. So for this video, I'm going to demystify manual mode for those of you who might be a bit intimidated to go manual, and that's why you're sticking to metering modes, aperture priority, shutter priority, etc. It's really not that complicated, and there's only a few things to think about, and anyone who wants to go professional in the long run, it's a great thing to learn. It will allow you to take full control of your camera and balance the different elements to get exactly the exposure you want. Because I think you'll work faster and you'll be more consistent in the shots that you get. So let's explain. Balancing exposure. Okay, so the three elements that make up the exposure triangle, as we'll have here, are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. It's just a case of balancing out these three elements to get the correct exposure or the light in the correct place. So ISO is going to run, let's say, from 100 to 6400. That's, there's cameras that go beyond that, but that's not the point for this illustration. Say, down this end would be a darker exposure, and at the top here would be a lighter exposure, bringing in more light. For our shutter speed, let's put our darker exposure down this end, let's say 1/8 thousandths of a second, which would be a very fast shutter speed. That wouldn't bring in much light. Up at our bright end, let's say we had something like 8 seconds, like a landscape photographer leaving the shutter open, for a long period of time, bringing in a lot of light. They have to control the scene, but also it'll slow the motion down, which will of course look great in the landscape photography. And everything in between falls in line there as well. And obviously there's stuff outside of these ranges. Every camera is different, so remember that. For aperture priority, let's say f/22, right at the top is a very, very small aperture opening, wouldn't bring in much light, so it's dark. And let's say on this end, where it's brighter, say f1.4, that's quite a large opening. Now, to create any exposure, all I'm going to do is balance these three elements against each other. So if I want more light, I could bump up my ISO, I could slow my shutter down, or I could open my aperture. Any of these three, if I'm looking at my exposure saying it's too bright, I could darken it down by closing down my aperture, by speeding up my shutter, or by dropping down my ISO. Those are my three options, and all you need to know to make a good exposure is what the trade-offs are for each of these. So shutter speed's trade-off is, let's put this here, movement. And it just means that when you close down or speed up your shutter speed, what it's going to do is affect how movement appears. Up here, if you shoot something with 8 seconds shutter speed, it's going to blur. But if you shoot in 1/8,000th of a second, it's going to freeze your motion. Okay, so you need to know when you are playing with your shutter speed, The slower your shutter speed is going to blur motion, and the faster your shutter speed is going to freeze it. That's the trade-off for shutter speed. ISO, your trade-off is going to be noise. Okay, up here at 6400 is going to give you a high amount of noise in your image, and down here it's going to give you a low amount of noise in your image, especially at ISO 100. So if you introduce more ISO, it might be bringing more digital noise into your image. That is ISO's trade-off. Your aperture is going to introduce depth of field here. Okay, so it speaks about how much of your image is actually going to be in focus. You might want a very shallow, slice, a very shallow depth of field if you're shooting a portrait with just the front of the faces and in focus and everything else is blurred. Or a landscape photographer might want a very deep depth of field to keep everything in focus the whole way through the shot from foreground to background. So up here at f22, you're going to get a deeper depth of field than you would down at 1.4, which is going to give you a very shallow depth of field. So when we're deciding, should I darken things down by closing down my aperture? I'm gonna deepen my depth of field. Should I darken things down by speeding up my shutter speed? I'm going to freeze action. There's going to be less motion blur. Should I darken things down by lowering my ISO? That's great because there's going to be less noise in the image. If I want to brighten things up with my aperture, I'm going to shallow my depth of field. I need to be aware that if I slow down my shutter speed to brighten things up, I need to be aware that movement is going to start to blur. And if I open my ISO to brighten things up, I need to be aware that I might be introducing more noise. And again, when you understand each of these three things and how you're going to control your exposure in each of them and understanding their trade-offs, and you can understand those trade-offs, you can start to make decisions because maybe you want to blur the movement, maybe you want to shallow your depth of field. And within all of this, you're also going to get exactly the correct exposure that you want to achieve. That might sound a little bit complicated, but actually leaves you with only two questions to ask yourself at any exposure you make. Number one is, how do you want your depth of field to appear? And that will be shallow, and that is going to obviously relate to your aperture. Number two is going to be, how do you want movement to appear? Do you want to freeze or do you want it to blur? And the reason I say there's only two questions because the third would be, how much noise do I want in my image? And that's not even a question. We always want as little noise as possible. So ISO should be as low as possible. And that's where you always want to think. So in terms of creative questions, you might want to ask yourself, how do you want movement to appear? And how deep or shallow do you want your depth of field to be? These are the two questions you're going to use, and they're going to inform you how to balance those three elements to get the correct exposure. Okay, let's use a quick example just to drive this home. I've got my aperture, my shutter speed, and my ISO. And let's take two different photographers. So we'll say the first is going to be a sports photographer, and second be a portrait photographer. And they're both shooting in manual mode. Okay, so your sports photographer is going to ask himself these two questions. What do I want my depth of field to be? What do I want my shutter speed to be? But shutter speed in his case is going to be way more important because motion is very important and he wants to freeze action. So let's say he's shooting a football game and there's lots of stuff moving around. He wants to freeze that action. So he's gonna select something like let's say, I'll do this here, 1/4000th of a second to freeze that action. Okay, then he's gonna go, well, let's put my ISO as low as possible. It's a daytime game, so he's gonna be able to get away with ISO 100. And his aperture is gonna be, let's say, when he does everything and checks his exposure, it's looking good at f, we'll say 4. Because he's shooting a depth of field, maybe he wants it that's a little bit too shallow. Maybe he's shooting on a long lens and he needs to deepen that depth of field out. If he decides to go to f8, he's going to have to bump up his ISO to compensate because closing down his exposure is going to let in less light. He needs to make his ISO more sensitive to compensate for that, but he wants to keep that most important thing, which is his movement, frozen. Let's say a portrait photographer, she's in a studio, she knows that she's shooting on an 85 mil and she wants let's say 2.8. That's going to be the depth of field that she wants. She knows the most important thing is depth of field first. Now she's going to have to work out her exposure. So in a studio, let's say that she's on ISO 100 because she's got a strobe light. She can, get her ISO down as low as possible, keeping the noise out. But that's going to give her, for example, let's say 1/10 of a shutter speed. Now let's say that 1/10 of a second is introducing some shake in the camera. She's hand holding, the subject is maybe moving around slightly, introducing a slight amount of blur, and the thing isn't as sharp as it should be. So now, how does she get this to a better shutter speed that's gonna freeze that action a little bit more and not give her a blurry image? So let's say she takes it to 1/100 of a second. She needs to now bump her ISO up to compensate because she's given herself a faster shutter speed, which means she needs to increase her ISO to make it more sensitive to capture the light that's been lost by the fact that this shutter speed is firing faster, and her most important element here, again, is her depth of field. That's where she started. That's the question she's going to answer for herself and any photographer. If they and you are balancing these three elements, again, with each other, starting with those two questions, what do I want my movement to look like? What do I want my depth of field to be? Keep the ISO as low as possible. You can work out any question. You can work out any equation about what your settings in your camera should be while using full manual mode. So I hope this instills some courage in you to get out there and try shooting in manual mode. You decide what your aperture is, what your shutter speed is, what your ISO is, and if you work at it, I promise you, you'll be more comfortable with changing your settings in no time at all. I'm pretty sure it will expand the possibilities for your photography as well, because in every image, you're gonna be making these decisions about how deep, again, or how shallow you want your depth of field to be. You're gonna be working out exactly what you want your movement to look like in your shots. you're going to be nailing your exposures. So you're going to define a style much quicker by making these individual decisions. Not to mention, you're going to feel much more confident as a photographer. And if you're like me, you're going to enjoy the process more as well. So thanks again for watching. Please like this video if you've liked it, subscribe to see more content, and I'll see you in the next one.